I, Oneesha Wilson, am interviewing Hazel Lee as part of the Smithsonian's The Way We Worked exhibit in Florala, Alabama on April 19th, 2014. Please state your full name and spell your last name and tell me where you live.
My name is Hazel Lee, Lee. I live in Florala, Alabama.
Do you understand that you are being interviewed as part of the Smithsonian's The Way We Worked exhibit and knowingly consent to doing this recorded oral history?
Yes, I do.
May I proceed with the first question?
Sure, go ahead.
Please state your full name and where you currently live.
My name is Hazel Lee. I live in Florala, Alabama.
When and where were you born?
I was born in 1939 in Florala, Alabama.
As a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, at first I wanted to be a teacher. My grandmother said that I should be a missionary. But I read a book by Dr. George Washington, about Dr. George Washington Carver, and it made me, it piqued my interest in science. You know, as a child, I was always interested in how things work. Back then, our dolls were made out of cloth, and the bodies were stuffed with straw. The heads were sewn on. And if you tilted the dolls back and forth, the eyes would open and close, and then there was a crying mechanism on the inside of the doll. So I would take the head off the doll and tear the doll apart, tear all the straw out, to find out, number one, how the eye closing mechanism worked and how the sound mechanism worked. Then of course I'd cry because now my doll was torn up and I didn't have anything to play with. So I was always interested in things like that.
What type of chores did you have as a child?
Well, I helped my mother with various tasks. I mean, all of the things that she had to do, I helped with. I helped to wash dishes. And as you can imagine, back then in the early 40s, we didn't have a dishwasher. We didn't even have electricity, or we didn't have running water. So in order to wash dishes, we had to go out to our well, which was on the outside of the house, a ways from the house, draw the water up out of the ground, pour it into a pail, and then tote it to the house. And once there, we put it into a pot, put the pot on the stove, we boil the water, and then we use that for washing our dishes. By the way, our stove was not a gas stove, it was not an electric stove. Our stove was heated by wood. So my brothers would chop wood. That was part of their chores, to chop wood and pile it near the house. And one of my jobs was, as I got a little older, was to make the fire in the stove to make sure the stove was hot so that my mother could cook and so forth. I also helped with washing clothes. Again, we went through the same procedure almost, except it was now washing clothes, where we drew water from the well, put the water in tubs, and scrubbed the clothes with our hands on a scrub board. We boiled the clothes in a pot and took the clothes up, rinsed them, and hung them on a line. I also helped to sweep the yards. We didn't have grass in our yards. Most of our yards were sort of sandy dirt yards. So we had brush brooms that we made out of hedges and things, and we would take that, tie them together, and then sweep our yards with that. One other thing, keeping my room. I never had my own room back then, actually until I left home. But we were supposed to keep our room clean, and I never did like housework, so I got in trouble a little bit on that one. So that's basically, I had a lot to do.
What childhood memories do you have of your family working?
Well, let's see. My father worked, first of all, he was an automobile mechanic, and he was quite a good one. People used to come to the house looking for my father to fix one thing or another on their vehicles, the farm vehicles, their transportation vehicles, and he was really, really good. Then he went into the Second World War. He went into the Navy during the Second World War, and when he came out, he started working at Eglin Air Force Base. He was a vet, and so he got hired down there, and I think he worked in construction then. He's just a really smart guy, and he always worked. I don't remember him never working. He always had something to do. My mother did some part-time housework, so and she tended to us, and she tended to her house.
Do you remember hearing your parents talk about their work?
Not so much, except that my dad would talk about various little problems that he had to solve during the day. He might have had a particular troublesome situation with a car that he had to figure out, and he almost always did. Or he might have had a problem at the job, either with a person or with at a job assignment. So he might come home and talk about that. My mother, like I said, she did part-time housework. She talked about it from the perspective of that, number one, she didn't want us winding up doing housework. And number two, she sometimes talked about the people that she worked for and what they did in their houses and how they thought, and she was often critical of some of the ways that they thought and the ways that they treated people.
What was your first job outside of your home?
My first job outside of my home, believe it or not, was picking cotton. My mother never wanted any of her girls to pick cotton. But I wanted to go so bad I would cry to go pick cotton. I wanted to make a little money, and so she finally relented and let me go. And I don't know if you know anything about picking cotton, but it's a sack that you put across your shoulder. The cotton is planted in rows, and you have to either bend over to reach the cotton that's in the plant. The cotton is in a bowl like this, and you have to reach in and grab the cotton out. Now these things right here are sharp, so when you reach in to get the cotton, it often cuts. It can cut your fingers, and sometimes they bleed. But you reach in and you get the cotton and put it in your sack. Well, I wasn't good at that. I was not a good cotton picker, so therefore I realized fairly early on, I think I was about 10 or 12 years old, that I needed to learn how to do something else besides pick cotton if I was going to make a living.
Did you contribute to the family income?
No. I used my, whatever little money I made back then, I used it, put on a pair of shoes or whatever.
What is one of your best childhood memories?
My best childhood memories is a gathering of the whole family, either at home or at church. But at home, we would gather around the fireplace in the evenings. We would gather around the dinner table. Sometimes we would gather around a fire on the outside. We'd make a big fire on the outside, and everybody would sit around. And my grandmother and my mother and sometimes my uncles would tell tales about things that happened long ago, and that was so interesting. And that's how I learned about some of my other family members that I've never met. I learned the old stories about them. And then we'd sing songs and just have a good time. I mean, it was just a lot of fun. It's funny because of these kinds of gatherings that we had, I never felt like we were poor. We were dirt poor. But nobody told me I was poor. And it was just like with everybody else, just about everybody else in town was in the same position. So we didn't have that depressed kind of feeling, that draggy, depressed kind of feeling because, you don't have this and you don't have that. We were just satisfied with what we had, If we didn't have dolls, we went outside and we took the grass. It grew long, and we would plait the grass together, and that would be our dolls. We'd pull the grass up after we plaited the hair and wrap a little piece of cloth around it, and that would be our dolls. And so we used our imaginations, I think, more than kids use today.
What is one teacher you would say pushed you the most?
Okay, I have actually two school scenarios. One, up until the age of about 14, I lived in Florala, Alabama, and I went to a segregated school. Our teachers back then pushed us because they realized how difficult it was going to be for us to be able to navigate life. But the one that stood out the most, I think, is a male teacher. His name is Mr. Hill, Mr. James Hill. Now he later on went and got a doctorate, but when he came to us, he was a junior lieutenant in the Army with his uniform. He was just out of the Army, I guess, and he wore his uniform to school, and we thought he was just so handsome, and he was. But he was very interested in our education, and we felt it. And he made a way for us to learn a lot of things that we otherwise would not have learned. He actually fought for us to have books, to have access to educational materials. And he believed in us. He believed that we could accomplish it, and we did.
What do you / did you consider to be your main occupation or career?
Well, let me think about that for just a second, because let's see now. My career was varied. Okay, I started out as a cosmetics chemist, and then I went into sales, and then I did some marketing work, and I finally wound up in purchasing. So I think, though, that the main part of my career was that as a chemist, because that's how it all started. I was a cosmetics chemist, and then later I went to work for a petrochemicals company.
How did you decide on your career?
It was a bit difficult deciding on a career, because when I was in high school in the 50s, we didn't have, every field wasn't open to a black woman. And for instance, advertising was essentially closed to black people, and there were several other fields that were. So, but I knew, I wanted to be an actress, but I knew that was not a sure thing, Advertising was close to me, but I knew that the science fields were open, and so therefore, and I like chemistry, so therefore I went into chemistry.
How did you train for your career?
Well, I went to college, basically, and I majored chemistry. That was my training.
What type of technology did you use in the workplace?
Well, I started in the workplace in 1965, and so we just had basic laboratory equipment. Cosmetic formulations don't require, at least back then, they didn't require a whole lot of sophisticated equipment, although in our analytical fields, we had, fairly sophisticated analytical equipment. But we didn't have personal computers like we have today at all. So things have changed a lot. Computers changed the whole complexion of the workplace.
What were your wages or pay?
Oh, that. Okay. When I got out of college, I started working for a cosmetics company, and I started at $5,000 a year. Today, if you count for inflation, that would be worth about $37,000. Then in 1969, I went to work for a research and engineering company, for a petrochemical company, and I started at $13,000 a year, and that today, in today's dollars, would translate into about $87,000 a year. So, and then from then on, I got raises throughout my career, and wound up making a six-figure salary before my retirement.
How did your work change over time?
I think the biggest change that I saw, well, let me say this first. My work changed because the assignments that I got was a change. So I went from working in the lab to going into sales. I was the first female in sales for my company. Um, then I did some marketing work, and then I went into purchasing. So it changed that way. The various things that I was doing changed. Although all of it had to do with chemicals. When I was in sales, it had to do with chemicals. When I was in purchasing, it had to do with chemicals. So I needed that background. But having said that, the biggest change over time was a change in the workplace, was a change in diversity. When I first started working for the cosmetics company, there were women and there were people of color, a small number of people of color, but we were all on the lower levels. There were none of us in the managerial or decision-making levels. That has changed today, as it should be. And when I started working in the petrochemical industry, I mean, that was totally white male dominated. And that has greatly changed. I can remember when I would go to meetings and I would be not only female, the only black. Then you go to the airport, you're on the plane, it's you and a bunch of white guys. A whole lot of my career was at meetings with me and a bunch of white guys. That changed, and I was glad to see the change because women began to come in. These are women that are chemical engineers, they are accountants, they are at every professional level, and these women are competent. These women are competent, they are capable, and today they are running these companies. Some of them are running the companies, but a lot of them are in very key decision-making positions, and that is a good thing. That's a big change.
What do you consider to be your most meaningful professional accomplishment?
I think, well, let me see. I think my most meaningful accomplishment was my ability to learn a whole new way of life, the corporate way of life. I mean, I knew nothing. I knew nothing when I came there, and I was able to quickly absorb and adapt to while still maintaining my own identity. So I was able to navigate that world, and that was a big accomplishment.
What kind of opportunities did your career open up for you?
Oh, many opportunities. I got a chance to travel. I traveled at various places in the United States that I never would have gone. I also visited various kinds of industries that I never had seen before. I didn't know how to operate it. I went into plants that, when I was in sales, I went into plants that made automobiles. I went into General Motors and Ford and places like that, and I saw firsthand how the automobiles were put together. And I learned a little bit about that business. I also visited foundries where they make parts for various well, for the automotive industry and for other types of industry. These big foundries with the hot furnaces, and they take metal and they shape them into various parts. I visited pulp and paper mills, and I saw trucks come in with logs, and the logs were changed to chips, and the chips were fed into a chemical bath, and it was changed to a pulp, and then the pulp was changed into paper, and I saw the paper roll out on these big rollers, and it was fascinating. I also got a chance to travel to Europe, and I visited France and England and various places like that, Germany, whatever.
What is your most memorable traveling experience?
My most memorable traveling experience is not a happy one. When I was in Paris, I was with some other colleagues, and we were going to visit a company, one of our suppliers. We all hopped into a couple of cabs. I got into the front seat with all of my belongings and got out of the cab and left half of my belongings, including my passport and my and a book with my family history in it, and a camera. And I was never able to recover that. Was able to get a passport and get out of that country, but I don't think I'll ever forget that. It was such a loss to me. And the biggest loss, besides my passport, the biggest loss was the little notebook that I had with all the notes of my family history in it.
What effect did large events like wars, natural disasters, or other types of national or international disruptions have on your life and career?
I think the biggest event that occurred that affected my life and career was the Civil Rights Movement. Before the Civil Rights Movement, the South was totally segregated. Black people could not vote. There were no job opportunities for us. And that affected the entire nation, actually, because nationwide, career opportunities for black people, and women for that matter, was limited. So after the Civil Rights Movement, things began to open up. This is when companies begin to realize, look, we are missing talent here. There are people who have talent, and we're not hiring them just because of the color of their skin or because of their gender. And so they begin to broaden the net that they cast for employees, and that helped me a lot. And that actually that had the biggest effect on my life than anything.
I understood that you said your dad was in World War II. Mm-hmm. What effect did that have on your early childhood?
You know, that that had a big effect in the sense that all the able-bodied men in town left, and they went to war. Now, listen, I came from a small town. Florala still is a small town, but back then, most families had a little hog pen where we raised hogs, and those hogs were for our meat, and we had a cow for milk, and we had a little garden where we raised our food. So when the men left, there was nobody to kill the hogs anymore, and so we suffered. We didn't have the smoked meat that my father used to put up for us, and times were just harder without my father, and it had a big effect. I was really, really, really glad when that war was over and he came home.
Do you remember any type of labor strife or problems between workers and management at your place of employment?
No, we didn't have. Yeah, I do. I do remember. I don't remember a lot of strife, but I do remember having strikes in the plant from time to time. The Teamsters would strike from time to time. But I don't remember a lot of strife like we heard about with the coal miners and some of those people back in the day where people got killed or whatever.
How do you feel about the future work in the United States?
Okay, before I answer that, let me just talk a little bit about unions since you asked me about strikes. Okay? The unions, here's what I think. Unions were very important. Trade unions were very important to the progress of the work in this country, and very important to the building of the middle class. Had it not been for unions, we would have had an upper crust class of people, a huge class of poor people, and a very thin level of band of middle class people. But with the advent of the unions advocating for better wages and better working conditions, the middle class people were able to move from the poor level into the middle class and enjoy a better life. So the unions brought us vacations. I remember when people didn't get vacations. You just worked all year, but you didn't get a vacation. But the unions brought us vacations. They fought against child labor. Kids used to go to work, and kids worked in mines. They worked in all kinds of industry, but the unions were instrumental in stopping that child labor and enforcing getting some child labor laws instituted. So I just wanted to say trade unions are a very important part of our history and our future. Now, what was the question you asked me?
How do you feel about the future of work in the United States?
I think the United States is going to continue to prosper as long as we keep democracy in the forefront. As long as people are free, I think we're going to prosper. Now, yeah, the employment landscape changes because the skill requirements change. What was required 50 years ago or 70 years ago when I was a kid, what was required is not required now. So what I think is going to happen, there's always going to be a lag between technology and that skill level that you need. But I do believe that our labor force will continue to maintain the skills that is needed to match the requirements of labor. We have a good prospect.
What words of advice would you give to the future generations about their careers?
I would say to the future generation to, number one, decide what it is you want to do with your life. What do you want to do? And you don't have to be just one thing. You can be many things. I mean, you can have multiple careers. But decide on what it is, the things that you want to accomplish before you leave this earth. And once you decide on that, set your goals and set up the steps that you're going to take in order to meet those goals. Make sure that when you select your goals, that you're selecting something that's really going to make you happy when you accomplish that goal. You need to enjoy life. And in order to enjoy life, you need to enjoy what you do from day to day. If you have a career that you hate going to, but you're just going to because it pays well, you're not going to be happy. And the main thing in life is to be happy and productive, or productive and happy.
Is there anything else you would like to talk about not covered during this interview?
I can't really think of anything except I would just like to stress how important education is. And I know a lot of times when we're 13 or 14 years old, we don't recognize how important it is. There is one thing, though, that I would like to go back and go over. One thing that I didn't mention. I alluded to it, but I didn't mention. At the age of 14, I left Florala, Alabama. I left the state of Alabama, and I went to New Jersey, where I was able to get a better education. And I think that also had a really big impact on my life. I think if I'd stayed in Alabama, I would not have had a career, especially at that time. Most people that were successful, that were born in Alabama at that time, all of them had to leave Alabama in order to be successful. So, and that was the effect that segregation, that negative effect that segregation had. I'm glad that I was able to leave Alabama, although I went to stay with a relative and I left my parents and went to stay with a relative. But it was important to my parents that I got a good education. And that's why education, I think, is so important to me today. And it's important for me to pass that message along to the young people that you need to want to know. You need to want to know. You need to say, I am human. I need to know. I need to explore. I need to understand. And that's all I ask.
Well, I just want to thank you for doing this interview.
Thank you.